Welcome to Leadership is a Philosophy, Not a Checklist, Book Discussion 1, Up the Organization by Robert Townsend. So why did I pick this book? Well, this book was written in the late 60s, and it was written by a guy that took over Avis when it was basically on the ropes and turned it around radically. So the thing that I found most interesting about this book is that at no point during the entire thing does he discuss the fact that he's a great leader. And so if we take the philosophy that we talked about in the philosophy section, humility, empathy, integrity, and vigilance are everywhere in every precept, every tenet, everything that he talks about. So the book's really short. It's like a little pamphlet. And he does A, B, C, D, E, and for each one of those letters, he does a little thing about an organizational construct, and how to make it work. So he wrote it in the 60s, and one of the things that was a criticism of it, I guess, is that in the 60s, there weren't a bunch of female CEOs. So he says several things about women doing clerical work, or women being secretaries, or women doing this. So I say don't get all hung up on that because it was 50 years ago. He rewrote the book in the 80s, took a couple of chapters out, and then changed all of the she and female and wife to spouse and they and, a person. I actually prefer the original because you get to see what his real thinking is. And then, in your mind, just swap out, like one of the examples is, make sure that if you're going to have a secretary, that the secretary is fully employed because you don't want a bunch of women running around looking for trouble. Okay, so not a great line. However, replace that with employees and you're done because the wisdom is still correct. You've heard me say that before. So the core precept is you don't want a bunch of people that are half employed because then they walk around and cause problems. So make sure that everybody's fully employed. That's just me. I always like going to as close to the original as possible because then you get to see what the real thinking was. And just understand what the time is. And he didn't mean that. He had women that worked for him and he had female managers and all that stuff. So don't look at that and think that it's some sexist rambling or rant or whatever. So as we go through, I'm not going to discuss each one of the precepts, just sort of discuss the overall theme of the book. And then the one thing that I found the most significant about the book. But I highly encourage you to go buy it. I bought it on audiobook and a physical copy. I'm not sponsored or affiliated with any of these people, so get your own copy because it's worth having and it's worth reading. What will be interesting is if you're a natural leader, you're going to read this and go, oh, that makes sense. Why aren't we doing it? And if you're a management type who doesn't like things that are a little weird, you're going to think that it's stupid because there's no checklist. So that's that. That's all that I really have to say. So next we'll go to the PowerPoint and just walk through one slide on up the organization. Thanks for your time. Alrighty, welcome to the instructional portion of our book discussion, Up the Organization. As I said in the intro, this was published in 67, 68, and we're just going to walk through some of the high points about the book and why I think it's so important. So first thing is general themes. We talked about the philosophy. And the way that he wrote the book, it's just like I said, it's alphabetical. The funny thing is that in every one of the tenets that he talks about, integrity, humility, empathy, and vigilance are in all of them. Every time you can pull one of those things out. So as a general theme, one of the things he talks about a lot is transparency at all levels of the organization. One of his biggest rules was don't con anybody. He talks about if you're going to make a deal and you want to free up your time, find some smart person, say, I want you to go and make the best deal possible, and then you have to keep your word. So that's integrity. Don't lie about anything. Make sure that you're transparent in all this sort of stuff that you're doing. He says it makes people uncomfortable to talk about executive pay and all this sort of stuff, but it should be public. because one of the questions that he asks is the boss worth X millions of dollars? Now, again, it was written in the 60s, so big executives were making 60, 70, $80,000, which is like $5 or $6 million now. And so that's one of the things that he discusses is, have integrity. Don't con people. Don't lie. Be transparent. One of my favorite things is if you've got some little company policy that's floating around and they say, keep this close hold, that bothers me. Because if you're trying to hide something, unless obviously it's some major transition in the company that we're waiting for feedback on, but if you're coming out with some new policy and you're trying to keep it a secret, then there's a problem because you don't have the confidence that it's a good plan. Whoops. Next one is, this is something that I've seen some companies do or heard of some companies doing, but this is what Avis did. So everybody, including the big boss, vice presidents, CEOs, anybody that was working in the company at all had to go through the training for how to be a rental car associate. And then they had to go and work that job once a month. So you want to talk about amazing. You get to see how difficult it is or how crazy it is. I've been in an organization and been in other places where you wonder when the last time somebody actually did the work because some of the things they're talking about are so disassociated. But for me, I think that that's the way it should be. I mean, even if you're going to be a brand new boss, a brand new manager, a brand new something, you come in, you have to go do what the people that are the closest to the customer, the client, whatever, you got to go do their job so that you understand what you're putting people through or what the burdens are or how difficult it is. And I've been through that in a couple different organizations where you had to do what the workers were doing, the people that were actually making the money in the product. So that's humility and empathy, right? You're not that important. I don't care if you're the CEO. You're not so smart that you're so cool that you can't go down and do what the worker bees are doing. And I say worker bees not in a pejorative way because at the end of the day, they're the ones making all your money. And then you also have empathy because now you understand when somebody says, oh, I had this and this and this and this, and you go, oh yeah, I did that and it took me 3.5 hours. So I guess me adding a 3.5 hour process is not going to make their lives any easier. So I love this one. So if there's going to be a new form or a process done, the CEO has to do it himself or herself. So if there's some new form that you have to use, well, the CEO's got to use it. And with no help. Because what happens? Somebody comes up with some new great, brilliant, wonderful form, but none of the leaders want to use it because it's too cumbersome and a pain in the butt. Well, then why are you going to give it to your employees? How dumb is that? Why are you trying to make people's lives complicated? Just to say you made their lives complicated? So anytime there's some new system or process, the big boss has to do it. Because then the big boss is going to say, this is stupid. Or, oh my gosh, this is so much easier. Why aren't we doing this all over the place? Because what happens then? Well, then you start thinking, well, maybe this isn't such a great idea. You're not going to walk around and talk about how amazing your new process is if the boss doesn't like it or if it's just cumbersome. And so what's that do? That gives you empathy because now you understand, hey, this is not going to work. The example that I used during the hierarchy discussion when I said, you've got 4 or 5 different managers that want 4 or 5 different pieces of data reported 4 or 5 different ways. Well, that's not going to happen if this is going on or if you've got leaders at every level. So empathy and vigilance, because now that helps you pay attention. That also goes back to the thing that I talked about having a leader at every level, because then the leader can go and say, we're not doing that. It's too complicated. It's too hard. It's too much work. If we're going to get 2% better, but we have to do an extra 3 hours of work to get that 3%, is it really worth it? I don't know, but that's what somebody needs to sit down and figure out. Next is don't allow empire building. So he talks about if you're going to have corporate offices, everybody should have the same budget. Everybody should have the same square footage. Everybody should have the same amount of administrative support. Because what happens? People start getting rewards or start thinking, oh, I'm important, so I deserve a bigger office. For what? If it's important enough and you've got it, then schedule the conference room, right? And realistically, if you're actually doing a good job as a leader, you shouldn't hardly be in your office anyway, right? You should be out checking stuff. You should be out paying attention, using the whole vigilance thing. And that's why I like don't allow empire building. He also talks about moving the corporate offices around because then you sort of clean out the deadwood. But what happens? It's exactly what we talked about with the hierarchy. So the blanket of bureaucracy. You get somebody that's a bureaucrat and they've been there for too long, they start putting systems and processes in place and starting to build a little empire around themselves because they think their job is so important. It's important, but it's still not more important than somebody else's. And so you've got to make sure that somebody suddenly doesn't have this bloated staff that's doing a bunch of redundant work and getting in the way. What I mentioned in the beginning of the video, if you've got somebody that's there to do one specific job and it only takes them a half an hour, well, then for 7 hours, they're walking around looking for trouble or getting in trouble or causing trouble. So make sure that your people are working to the fullest extent possible. If you make promises, keep them. Oh, that's an interesting typo. Ignore that. But yeah, so if you say that you're going to do something, mean it. If you go on vacation, put somebody in charge and let them be in charge. If you are going to do a deal or do a contract or do a plan, put somebody in charge of it. Say, I'm going to support whatever you do. Here's the parameters, and then leave it alone. But if you and then also don't promise all the time. I have a rule where I say, look, I very rarely make promises, but when I make a promise, I keep it. And so don't be walking around saying platitudes and all that sort of stuff. People will know 100% if you're trying to, as they say, blow sunshine to a certain spot. And then my favorite thing in the whole book, and this also goes back to the leaders being at every level and having somebody who's keeping an eye on the organization, and they call it the BS detector. So he references that Billy Graham had a guy that worked for him that would walk around every so often and look for new bright ideas and see what they were like. And if they were garbage, then he would yell garbage. Mr. Townsend had a guy that worked for him, and it was his job to say, hey, great idea, but it's stupid. This is just a bunch of crap. You're trying to make a bunch of work because it sounds snazzy. Why don't we just tweak this process? And the reason that I love that so much is that's the idea that I talk about, having a leader at every level. Because if you have a leader type that's at every level of the organization, as they're doing their daily business and daily work and looking around for stuff, all of a sudden here comes this brilliant idea. What are we doing that for? You're doing something. We've got a process that's in place that nobody's implementing fully. And now you're trying to build something to go on top of that process. So what are we doing, right? We're just going to add more stuff that's not going to get done? Or why don't we fully implement the process that we're supposed to be using? Who knows? But this person's amazing. And then you have to tell that person that they're not going to get fired unless they don't do it. So then they're actively trying to keep garbage from piling up. And that's their job, because then when you know that's going to happen, suddenly you're like, oh, maybe I need to really think this through before I go and try to implement it. As we talked about from the Tao Te Ching, the higher up you are in the organization, the less stuff you should do. The quieter you should be, the more you should be paying attention. Anyway, but yeah, the BS detector, it's a great deal. So on leadership, now as I discussed in the intro, he didn't say anything about him being a leader in this book, but everything he says is leadership oriented. And then the funnier part is he talks about the fact that he doesn't have any idea what makes a leader. And the problem is, it's sort of sad because this is a thoughtful guy. And I just don't think that he had somebody that he could sit around and talk to it about, because that's what I'm trying to do with this project, is get down and say, this is what makes a leader. So he had some pretty pithy things to say about leaders, which was funny. So it's the L section of the book. But the first thing that he does is he has 2 quotes from the Tao Te Ching in there. The first one being, if you want to lead the people, you got to follow them. And then the other one being, the best type of leader is one that nobody knows exists. The second best one is one everybody loves. Third best is one that's feared, and the fourth is the one that's despised. Those are 2 quotes that he uses in the 60s about leadership from the Tao Te Ching. So I had to laugh because I had written most of the stuff that I was trying to use for this project, and then found this book, and I was going, it's already been done. But once again, he's quoting something from 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. So references the same subject as Simon Sinek's video on Leaders Eat Last. And so, you know, in the military, at least I know in the Army when I was doing it, the tradition was, and sort of the rule was, is that the officers always ate last. Well, why? Well, because the soldiers are doing all the fighting. The soldiers are doing all the work. They're the one doing all the maintenance. And then you also know if the officers, because the officers usually did it, plan the right amount of food. Because if everybody in the organization has eaten and there's no food left for the officers, well, then the officer messed up. But who gets to suffer from the screw up? The officer, which is good. But that was the tradition, and it was always the thing. And it was, you know, the highest ranking officer would ask and make sure that everybody else had eaten before they ate. And the ones that didn't do that, because there were some, they were mocked. They were hated because it was, you know, what makes you think you're so important? No matter what organization, even in the military, your job doesn't exist unless the employees are there. And so you need to make the employees as comfortable as possible while still getting the job done. And that includes making sure that you're the last one to get any of the good stuff. So yeah, if you haven't seen the Simon Sinek video, go watch it. But once again, what is that? That's humility. It's also empathy. Because and also make sure that you go eat the food that the soldiers are eating. Because sometimes the people making the food are not doing the right thing. So once again, this was written in the 60s. So you look at it now. Most employees in companies are administered, not led. He also says that current hierarchies are so infested with rules and traditions that in most cases leadership is just following regulations, which is what I talked about, which is, you know, people say leadership is action, not position. Well, yeah, you put somebody in charge and they're just managing the system. They're not a leader. They're just an administrator. They're not leading anything. The leader should go up there and say, what are we doing? Get rid of this, get rid of that, get rid of this. Let's make things easier. One of the things he talks about, too, about rules and traditions is, what was it? So human resources policies. It says get rid of all of them. If you're going to do it, publish the 10 Commandments. Because you know how it can go when you start making a bunch of crazy policies. Then you have to have policies on top of policies on top of policies, to the point that where somebody becomes a policy wonk and can go around and figure out a way to either make your life miserable or get out of something because there's some policy. Which also goes back to the Tao Te Ching. If you have too many rules, then nobody's following them. Which is also in Bastiat's The Law, if you want to have some fun reading that. Next. Oh, yeah. So he complains that the leaders from the past, referencing founding fathers, Lincoln, Washington, people further back in history, don't exist anymore. Well, I mentioned that during one of the videos as well, is all of these leaders that we talk about that were great examples and had humility, had integrity, had empathy, and had vigilance, not a single one of them went through any of our current MBA training. Not a single one of them went through any of our leadership schools. So what did they have that made them leaders? What was it? Well, that's where I go back to the talent. And then the talent attenuated or modulated by the philosophy, the ideal philosophy, made a good leader. That's what it is. So instead of sending somebody to school, because that's not what we did before, and sending somebody to some class, we got to go find people that have the leadership talent and then make sure that they've got the philosophy that they're applying when they're going out and using it. Oh, I had a quick example that I was going to mention. Oh, yeah. In my honest opinion, because the leaders that I have worked for have been to a whole bunch of different schools, I think that those people became leaders despite what they were taught, not because of what they were taught. Because think about the very example from The Problem, where we had the two people that were in the company. One was the distinguished graduate from the leadership school, and the other one was middle of the road, but the middle of the road one was an amazing leader, and the person that was the distinguished graduate was terrible. So it's not school that makes you a leader. It's not the class that makes you a leader. Okay, so sort of to conclude this a little bit, he says, how do you spot a leader? So all of this is true, and I just had to laugh because this is exactly the same point that I'm trying to make, but he made it 60 years ago. They come in all shapes, sizes, and genders. Some are poor administrators because paperwork is a pain in the neck, and it's mostly done by somebody who doesn't care that you have to do all the paperwork. Some are not overly bright, which is what I was talking about in the competency, where the leader is usually pretty good at their job tasks, but they're not the best at them, but they're really good at being in charge of people. And so they're not the most highly skilled person, because then the highly skilled person is the top of the competence hierarchy for that work. Anyway, so they're not overly bright. One clue is, since most people are mediocre, a true leader can be recognized because somehow or other his people turn in superior performances. That's exactly what I talked about during the solution. How are you going to identify a leader? How are you going to find one? Well, this is how you do it. Hey, look at all this crazy work. Who's running the show? Or what's going on with this? Because sometimes you might even have a leader on a team that's not in charge of the team, that's still getting everybody motivated around there to do it. So this block on leadership reinforces all the points that I was trying to make in the opening series. And at the same time, he was an amazing leader. He just didn't recognize it. He sat around and said, well, I don't know. Here's what I did. He references Peter Drucker and The Human Side of Management, I think is the name of that book. I have to try to find it because it's out of publication. We're going to do a discussion about that book as well. But I think this guy had sort of recognized all of the same sort of stuff that I'm talking about, but he just didn't sit down and think about it, because then he would have realized that he was a great leader. But most leaders don't sit around and think about how amazing they are. They're just not. If they're really humble, they really have empathy, and they have integrity, they're not thinking that they're the most amazing thing on the planet, because they're just another person. Anyway, just to summarize that, so here's the cover of the book. Robert Townsend. Obviously, there's two different versions. There's the original versions from the 70s. The one that I watched or listened to was on an audiobook, and it was one where it was the original book, and then there were footnotes. So the footnotes were any time that he had changed something between the 1970 version and the one that was published in the 80s, there was an annotation. I prefer that one because it's back to the original, right? It's closer to the original. And like I told you at the beginning, unfortunately, I went and did a bunch of research on, 30 or 40 leadership reading lists, and this book wasn't on any of them, which, kind of tells you all you need to know, because a lot of them are a bunch of management books. This one is considered management, but it's not. It's leadership. It's a great leadership book. And as I said, this is not a sponsored discussion. I get nothing from this, so that's why I didn't put links to anything on here. Go find the book. It's not that hard. And as always, thank you very much for your time. The next video that I'll be posting will be a movie review. A movie discussion. Not so much into reviewing. All right. Thanks for your time, and have a great day.